Hi guys, it's Tessa. My lit review was on childhood obesity, the epidemic, the contributing factors, and the future focus of the research. As an introduction, there are 42 million children under the age of 5 in the world right now that are overweight. 31 million of them are from developed countries. The fundamental cause of childhood obesity is basically the fundamental cause of obesity in general, which is the calories consumed exceed calories expended. There's also the idea of an obesogenic environment, which is inclusive of factors such as genetics, parental influence, energy dense foods, decrease in physical activity, increase in sedentary nature, and also race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and low education. Uh, World Health Organization states that childhood obesity is one of the most serious public health challenges of the 21st century, so we should all be somewhat cognizant of it. By definition, childhood obesity or childhood overweight, is one standard deviation body mass index for age and sex, while obesity is two standard deviations. The children pictured here are obviously two. So, why is this important to know this topic? Well, childhood behaviors become adult habits. In a survey of 6,000 adults, only 2% of those who were inactive adolescents made a behavior change to become an active adult. There's not one cause to childhood obesity, but multiple causes. The obesogenic environment can be defined as the sum of influences that our surroundings, opportunities, or conditions of life have on promoting obesity in individuals or populations. Childhood obesity specifically is likely a result of the interactions of natural selection, favoring those with a more parsimonious energy metabolism, and also today's consumerist society, which has easy access to energy dense and cheap foods, and there's also much lessened energy expenditure requirement for daily life. So, looking at the outline for this review, we're going to look at the underlying causes of childhood overweight and obesity, inclusive of screen time, nutrition, genetics, and take a quick look at race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and education level. Then we'll delve into the intervention versus prevention area of research, looking at what's been done and where the research is going, and we'll draw some conclusions of it. Starting off with screen time, sedentariness, and caloric expenditure, there is no shortage of literature looking at the effects of screen time on obesity. Data can be found on children from all ages across the globe. Specifically, a study by Jackson and Company found that kids that use electronic devices for 3 or more hours per day had a 17 to 44% increased risk of being overweight and a 10 to 61% increased risk of being obese. Now, I know these are quite a wide range for both of these categories, which is something that we'll talk about here in a minute. I first want you to look at this table from DeSiles, which part of his review was looking at comparing screen viewing for kids in Malta to those in a number of other countries. And I just want you to see the very high prevalence of screen viewing across different nations in both TV watching and then playing games on the computer and a game console. So you see that Switzerland's doing pretty well, but across the board, other than Switzerland and other than Malta, not so great. The majority of time spent that children spend engaged with screen devices, they spend being sedentary, sitting or laying down. Therefore, a correlation exists between screen time and daily energy expenditure. A study by Epstein showed that reducing TV viewing and computer use can decrease age-adjusted BMI. Ouija and company found that a reduction of screen time to less than 1 hour a day could result in a reduction of overweight prevalence in the order of 2 percentage points in both high and low risk subgroups. Of course, there's two sides to every coin. So on the flip side, there's studies which indicate that screen time may not be impacting levels of childhood adiposity. In 2011, Jackson and Company studied 482 children with an average age of 12 years old, and they found that use of information technology did not predict BMI or body weight, which is contrary to popular belief. Going back to DeSile's study, we're going to look at another chart here, which indicates the screen time may not be the sole contributing factor to childhood obesity, which is where we get the confliction here. You can see here they have boys and girls of normal weight, overweight, and obese. And you can see that when you take a look at time spent watching TV or using the computer or internet, etc., or playing games, the levels are quite similar. They're not statistically different uh, between normal weight, overweight, and obese children. So the conclusions of this section include that the sheer amount of research available pertaining to the topic of screen time effects on childhood obesity should indicate a cause for global concern in teachers and parents and in everybody. Within the literature, screen time nearly always appears as a constant regardless of age, gender, region, environment, socioeconomic status, level of education, etc., etc. Though it may not be the sole or even the primary cause of childhood overweight and obesity, it appears to be a definite contributor. So now we move to the role of nutrition. The problem being the availability of energy-dense foods that are high in fat and sugars, yet they're low in vitamins, minerals, other micronutrients, as well as some macronutrients. So this chart is an excerpt from Liangli, which demonstrates the contributing factors of what we've talked about thus far: screen time, snacking, and sugar-sweetened beverages on childhood obesity. And you can see the bold p-values there that show significant findings. So the role of nutrition, again, looking at in 2012, Epstein, which we visited before, he says that while his research did indicate a correlation between screen time and BMI, which we looked at, a reduction in caloric intake was thought to be the greatest contributor to the BMI decrease. Also in 2012, Saavedra described what he calls parental feeding practice, or PAPP. This is an abbreviation in Spanish, so it doesn't quite correlate in English, but nevertheless, he says that children's weight has been associated to multiple specific diet factors, and these in turn are associated to specific parent feeding practices. So the low food quality, the consumption patterns, and the food preferences of children are highly associated to parental feeding practices. So basically, if the parents eat crappy food, if they give their children crappy food, then that's the food that children will eat. Those are the behaviors that they will adopt. In 2007, Cole described two possible components to nutritional implications of childhood obesity. The first, he said, was called programming of appetite and how it's changed. So the appetite in some children is upregulated, and this can happen as early as in utero. Then the second possibility is that the programming of appetite is unchanged, but hungry children now get fat due to the obesogenic environment. So this is looking somewhat at nature versus nurture, your environment versus like physiological effects prior to birth. Accessibility also plays a role here. The probability of being overweight and obese was 26 and 33% less, respectively, among children residing in neighborhoods with good access to shops relative to children from neighborhoods with poor access to shops. So availability of access to shops with nutritious foods is what we're looking at there. So in conclusion of the role of nutrition, there's many contributing factors existing that determine the quality of diet in children. The majority of these are determined by the parental habits and parental actions prior to pregnancy, during pregnancy, and specifically after. It's most likely a combination of both nature and nurture. Dietary habits of parents become dietary habits of children, and therefore parents must be cognizant of what they're eating, what they're giving their kids, the choices they're making, the availability, and even where they live. Moving on to genetics and parental influence, researchers have found that genetics and parental influence are one of the most, if not the most prominent contributory factor of childhood overweight and obesity. Specifically in this, looking at the BMIs of parents, as a number of studies report that children of parents with high BMIs are at greater or greatest risk of childhood obesity. For example, Cole in 2007 stated that the greatest risk factor for childhood obesity is the obesity of both parents. this he goes on to talk about that this obviously isn't the only factor, because if it was sheerly based on, we talked about genetics, but he talks about how genetics isn't the only factor. Because if this were the case, then the child's grandparents and great grandparents also should have been obese, and in most cases, that's not true. So he goes on to talk about what he calls transgenerational process, which is high levels of fat in the mother during pregnancy prepare the child to be fat later in life. And she's influencing the child's fetal growth pattern. Simultaneously, an obese father may influence the neonatal growth pattern and program the child to have an increased appetite. So the conclusions of genetics and parental influence is that the impact of parental BMI on the severity of obesity in children is strengthened as a child grows into adolescence. So it can start in birth, and then patterns are established at a very young age. Those patterns become habits, and the habits now, when they're adolescents, become choices and no longer their parents' choices, and now they're kind of set in stone. So the age at onset of obesity is probably less important than the magnitude of it. The influence of parental weight primarily affects the severity of childhood obesity and not the timing of it. It's inevitable, basically. So moving on, we'll touch lightly here on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and level of education. I just wanted you to take note that these variables are often overlapping, and in many low socioeconomic neighborhoods, these encompass primarily minority population oftentimes. Within these neighborhoods, there's a limited availability of fresh, nutritious foods and access to these foods. There's either limited or no existence of a safe outdoor play area. It simply does not exist. And then also schools in these type of neighborhoods tend to have lower educational levels. So now we've got all of these compounding variables, and it makes it very difficult to decipher the exact cause of the elevated childhood obesity rates for these populations. So we'll move on to intervention versus prevention. In 2011, Wahi and company described a total of screened a total of 1,120 citations and 22 studies of children under the age of 18, with interventions that focus particularly on reducing screen time. Systematic review and meta-analysis did not demonstrate evidence of effectiveness of any interventions aimed at reducing screen time in children or reducing BMI or screen time. So if the intervention aimed at reducing screen time, the BMI overall wasn't reduced, nor was the screen time reduced, basically is what they're saying. The gleaming light in this review is that they did find that interventions in the preschool age group did hold some promise. We'll come back to that. In 2012, a qualitative study, and this was my favorite study that I looked at during this review, a qualitative study was conducted by Hesketh, and she looked at the comparison of views of parents of infants and preschool children on physical activity and screen time. So new parents overall perceive themselves to have a great influence on their child's level of physical activity. They are very optimistic, whereas parents of preschoolers perceived that they had little to no control over the child's physical activity, and that their children naturally engage in adequate amounts of physical activity on their own, so therefore they didn't need to do much to initiate it. So you can see the change in just a few short years. This slide I added for your entertainment and my own, as you can look at quotes from new parents versus preschool age parents on using television as a babysitter and negative aspects of screen time. So you can go ahead and pause this and read those because they're entertaining. When looking at intervention versus prevention in the fall of 2013, just to kind of make it official, the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Disease convened to do two things. One, to summarize the current state of knowledge regarding the prevention of infant and early childhood obesity, and two, to identify research gaps and opportunities. And they concluded that once obesity develops, it is likely to persist in children. And they called for an increased focus in the literature on prevention at the earlier stages in life. So even though we saw these kinds of trends starting in 2012, this summit in 2013 made it official, and they made a big announcement. So the conclusions for this section is that there is an urgency to establish healthy eating and activity patterns prior to the age of 2 years old. During this time, parents are highly motivated. They foster these feelings of ability to have a positive influence on their children, and children are just in the beginning stages of learning lifelong behaviors. So if they learn the behaviors correctly to begin with, there won't be need for a behavior change or intervention in the future that may or may not work. So the overall conclusion of this study is that it's difficult to impossible to decipher the sequential order and the magnitude of impact of the many underlying factors contributing to childhood overweight and obesity. These factors should be viewed not as separate entities, independent of one another, but instead as a continuous sum of influences, one each affecting the other. There's through biological, physiological, and environmental means, parental choices and habits translate into lifestyle habits and choices of their children. So prevention of obesogenic behaviors prior to age 2 should prove more effective than the past interventions which have not been effective that were aimed at older children. So knowing what we know now about all of this, my recommendations and applications is that I feel that the factors influencing parents following the birth of a child may create an opportunistic setting for family behavior modification. So this would be prevention for children and intervention for parents. And a few factors are at work here that might allow this to work. For example, new parents will do anything for their newborns, especially if ensuring safety, happiness, and health. New parents tend to be highly optimistic in their ability to influence the lives of their children. At this time, everything in this adult's life has changed upon having a baby, so a behavior change of diet and physical activity may be less of a shock because everything's a shock right now. So they may also be too tired or preoccupied to overthink or fight the behavior change. And then there's also the aspect that new mothers may have a higher level of motivation to lose excess body weight through diet and physical activity. So if this is true and if successful, then this technique could potentially cause a decrease in both childhood and adult obesity. And that's what I got. Thanks, guys.